Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons, and my guest today is someone who's at the forefront of the fight to secure a global commitment to limit greenhouse gas emissions at the Paris Conference on climate change later this year. The aim, to cut emissions sufficiently to avoid more than 2 degrees centigrade of global warming. Rachel Kyte is Vice President of the World Bank and its Special Envoy on Climate Change. Welcome to the interview on France 24.
Thank you.
François Hollande, of course, is the host of the conference in Paris at the end of this year. He said not very long ago that it would take a miracle to achieve a sustainable agreement on climate change, but that he believed in miracles. What about you? Do you believe in miracles?
Well, I believe in herding cats, which is the task ahead of the French government as hosts. This is a consensus-driven process, and so they have to bring into the room 190 countries or so, all at different stages of development, all of which will have to make.
That's a lot of countries to bring together to achieve an agreement.
Yeah, and you've got highly developed countries who will have to become much more efficient over the next 20, 30 years, and you've got the least developed and some fragile and conflict-affected states who just need a lot of assistance to be able to move forward and meet basic needs.
Yeah. Well, at the Copenhagen conference, which most people regarded as a failure, one of the big obstacles to achieving any sort of agreement was the differences between what you could call the developed world on the one hand and the major developing countries on the other, what people are calling the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Do you think that this time round there's a move towards consensus between those two blocs?
Well, I think two things have happened in the intervening 6 years. First of all, we have a situation where expectation management is at the front of everybody's mind. Nobody wants to have another Copenhagen. The second is that 6 years on, for the middle-income countries and for the BRICS in particular, to build a future which will continue to sustain prosperity, get rid of the remaining pockets of poverty and be able to have a clean development so that you can breathe in those new big cities that they're building, then they realise as a matter of national self-interest that they have to grow with much less intensity of carbon. And so it's less of a north-south divide and more of a question of future competitiveness and how will everybody move forward at what speed.
What about China? Because China's a massive economy, also heavily polluted and heavily dependent on carbon fuels. Do you see a shift happening in China? I
think one thing that Monsieur Hollande has going for him in terms of miracles is that there is a very interesting dialogue between the US and China. And they have reached a common agreement amongst the two of them about how they're going to move forward. China has to invent a future at a scale that nobody has ever managed to do or ever had to do before. It has to extend clean energy to all Chinese. It has to continue to grow the economy at a very fast rate. It has to do so in a clean way. It has to clean up the air in its cities. It has to clean up its water. So it has a substantial sort of challenge to its own economic future. And frankly, the submission by China in advance of Paris, its intended national contribution, how China intends to get on a pathway to 2 degrees, shows a real ambition. 25% of the energy mix being made from renewables by 2030 and peaking their emissions by 2030. So the question for China is, can it stay ahead of a race to survive, and can we all help them get there quickly enough?
And Brazil has just done a deal with the United States on an agreement with the United States on climate change as well. But what about India too? Because another economy that's beginning to develop very fast and is also extremely big and also heavily reliant on carbons.
So for India, and this, just by comparing and contrasting the BRICS, you can see the different stories for each economy. So for India, a lot of poor people without access to energy, so a need to really build renewables at scale, a real need to clean up the energy that they already have and the grid that they already have, so massive needs for energy efficiency. 500 smart cities Narendra Modi has introduced as a concept. They have to be built and lived in a very different way than in the past. Brazil, different issue. They're very much a landscape issue. Brazil, in the last 20 years, holds the sort of pole position in managing deforestation. They have to continue to manage deforestation down to zero, but they have a huge need to restore degraded land and bring that back into effective production. Yeah. They also have constraints on their hydro because of droughts and changing weather patterns, and they have to be able to use the fossil fuel resources they've discovered offshore in an efficient way. So very different challenges for all of these major growing economies, each one at a different stage with different real challenges presenting themselves.
At the moment, we've just been talking about nation states. What about businesses? One of the things that François Hollande said very recently, that he believed that getting business on board was the key to getting a deal. Is that something that you would agree with as well?
I think one of the features of the Paris Agreement, unlike Copenhagen, is it's really going to be a package deal. There'll be a negotiated text, there'll be a political statement, there will be a finance package, and then there will be a number of partnerships which are really delivering material change. Business is very important in that, as are cities and municipal leaders. Yeah. So for business, the future, now announced by the G7 as well, building off the science from last year, is that we have to, by 2100, have an economy which is zero net emissions. That means that the economy has to be in balance with the ecosystems of the planet. So we have to decarbonise growth, as the G7 said. We have to decarbonise development. So for a business, how to imagine that you'll be competitive in a world where carbon will be more and more expensive because prices will emerge from carbon, and imagine that your products and services can be competitive in a world where carbon is not being used, or it's part of a closed economy. That's the future, and you see CEO after CEO, sector after sector, struggling to work out what that means for their business.
But there is a sort of change happening in the consciousness, the collective consciousness of business.
I think there's a change globally, and then especially within business. The financial sector is looking at where the opportunity is. That's true for manufacturing. It's true even for the oil, gas and mining sector. So where is the opportunity? Where's the future business in a world where carbon is constrained? Yeah. I think there's also momentum. In June we had a double punch. We had a G7 statement which went further than most people thought in urging decarbonised growth, and then we had the encyclical from the Pope, and I think that's given real momentum globally.
Do you really think it's possible to take carbon out of the economy? I mean, look at Russia, for instance. Totally dependent on gas and oil exports. How can you persuade the Russians to make a move like that?
Well, I think that if you count the complete cost of carbon in, not only is the emissions and the what it's doing to climate change important, it's also that burning carbon has a deleterious sort of local development impact. That's the cause of massive spending in healthcare systems because of respiratory diseases, etc. It's the cause of the very dirty air in cities, which make them uncompetitive. Businesses don't want to move to those cities. And so if you take the local and the global, carbon has a real cost associated with it. I think where economists agree on the back of the science now is that the cost of inaction is much higher than the cost of action.
What about the World Bank? You're Vice President of the World Bank. What is it doing to try to address the issues involved?
Well, we understand now that the country clients that we serve and the companies that we serve now have to build prosperity in a development process which has to be very different because it has to be without carbon. And we have to build resilience because the climate impacts are already here, and the poorest and the most vulnerable in particular are suffering now. So what it means for us is that we have to change the way we do our business. We've changed our discount rates because our view of the future has changed. Yeah. We've put disaster and climate risk screening into all of our projects. We're talking to countries about different pathways of growth and development. And that's just the beginning. I think over time we will understand more and more what our lending and our technical assistance is needed for.
Just a few months remaining to the Paris conference. What, in your view, would constitute a real success?
I think that Paris should be thought of as the floor. Yeah. And from Paris we will build. We have a very different process this time around than in previous convention discussions. Countries are saying this is what our contribution will be, and the international process is going to say, okay, let's look at that, okay, let's check how you're doing, and then you're going to have to come back and say, okay, now we're moving faster or we're moving further forward in this area. We're talking about a sort of total economic overhaul, not just a pollution control agreement. And so if we imagine that Paris is a floor and then we're able to have a sort of process of back and forth going forward from Paris, I think we'll see momentum really begin to build. If we think that this is the good old days of somebody sitting in a global space and saying, thou wilt do, that is not what Paris is around.
If an agreement isn't achieved, what might be the consequences for all of us? What sort of an abyss, in other words, might we be looking into?
Well, to not reach an agreement would be to turn our backs on the scientific evidence, would be to turn our backs on the economic evidence, to turn our backs on the business case. Business as usual is extremely dangerous. Business as usual means that we will be headed for 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 or even more by the end of the century. The cost of that in terms of lives, in terms of our ability to build prosperity are unthinkable in some ways. And so I think that's actually understood around the world. And the question is the political leadership there, and can it be mustered to take the issue and say, I'm going to build a consensus in my city, in my municipality, in my country, rather than sort of sitting back and saying, well, is there a consensus? And if there is, then I will act. I think this is a moment when people are going to have to step out and step forward. And I think you see President Hollande, Chancellor Merkel, the President of China, Narendra Modi, Dilma Rousseff, President Obama, all, I think, with this on their priority list.
And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for today. Thanks very much, Rachel Kyte, for being with us on the interview. Thank you to the viewers, too, for watching us. But don't go away. More news and headlines to follow.